Hello. Last week's Birth of Reforestation episode, at the end, I said we'd be switching over to some Zoom episodes for the next few. Well, I've reshuffled things a little bit, and instead of interviewing anybody this week, I'm going to take you back out into the field. We're headed up to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan for an episode on the Kingston Plains. So settle in, sit back, and welcome to North Country History with Rob Berg. North Country History with Rob Berg, your podcast on the forest history of the Great Lakes region. Today, I'd like to take you on an adventure to the Upper Peninsula. We're heading to the Kingston Plains, located southwest of Grand Marais in the east central part of the Upper Peninsula, just south of Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore. The Kingston Plains is a unique landscape, not just for the Upper Peninsula, but for Michigan and the Great Lakes region as a whole. It is what we call a stump field, but one on an entirely different scale than what's going to be found in other parts of the region. A stump field is an area that had been cut over and usually also burned over lumberlands, where the major feature on the landscape that survives are the charred stumps, the remnant of the lumbering of the late 1800s and early 1900s. At the Kingston Plains, it's done on a much larger scale than what you're going to find at other locations, such as at Hartwick Pines State Park, areas of the Manistee National Forest in the Lower Peninsula, and located scattered through the Upper Peninsula, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and anywhere where logging was done on a large scale. The enormous size of the Kingston Plains stump fields is the result of numerous fires that burned after the logging. Logging was done at the Kingston Plains from the 1880s up through the 1890s into the early 20th century. But fires were affecting the region from the 1890s up through into the 1930s, with some of the most severe fires happening around 1911 at the time of the well-known Au Sable La Scotia fire in the northeastern Lower Peninsula, but fires burning also here or up in the Upper Peninsula around Grand Marais and Munising at that time. What happened is with the fires, they burned very hot. After logging, you had all the slash that was left, and it would be all over the ground there, and it would dry out, and it was susceptible to sparks from railroads and from lightning and from any other form of combustion, and it just burned and burned and burned. When you had all of that fuel on the ground, the fire was going to burn very hot. And what that did at the Kingston Plains, along with in other places, is that it could bake out the nutrients out of the soil to where nothing could sustain being grown. No seeds existed anymore, and there was no nutrients to fertilize the ground to allow for anything to come back. After the fires burned through, what remained was pretty much a skeleton of a forest that was once there. You had the snags, the trees that were still standing that had burned, and some of them breaking off 10, 12 feet high, and basically very large stumps. But you also had the stumps on the ground there at ground level where they had been logged. And with the heat of the fire, it carbonized the wood of those stumps, and it really acted as a great preservative for them. And those stumps, as they weathered, they stayed. They did not rot away. There was zero moisture left in that wood, and it just kind of sat out there through all the seasons, through all the years, until to this day, you're going to see acres and acres and acres of stumps with small growth around in the area there, but it is a visual memorial to the forests that were once there. In May of this year, I went on my vacation to the northern lower peninsula and the upper peninsula, and I was able to get out to the Kingston Plains. While I was out there, I did one of my early field recordings for this podcast at the Kingston Plains. So I'm going to play for you what I spoke while I was out there. I'm at the Kingston Plains in Alger County in the Upper Peninsula, located southwest of Grand Marais and a little bit south of the Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore, the Grand Sable Dunes region. Is one of the most impressive stump fields that survives the lumber period, definitely in Michigan, probably in the entire Great Lakes region. This stump field is a remnant of the logging period of the 1890s and early 1900s, and then of the wildfires that burned through afterwards. As I like to say, the fire follows the axe, and that was no different here on the Kingston Plains. When the Alger Smith and Company and other lumber companies were logging this part of the eastern Upper Peninsula, they left the slash on the ground. All of the smaller trees that were not worth harvesting but had to be taken down to make way for the larger trees to come down, those that were needed to be cleared to build the railroad grades, and also the tote roads, the way to get the logs out of the forest to the railroads. And then also any of the branches and any debris from the trees that were not of interest to the lumbermen. This was left on the ground and it dried out, and it was just waiting for a lightning strike or near the railroad for errant sparks from the steel wheels on the steel tracks, or cinders coming out of the locomotive to start a fire that would spread through with all of this ready fuel and just would burn out of control. A conflagration would appear in the middle of nowhere, and left unchecked, they would burn themselves out, or they would burn into areas of property, and that's when they became a concern. With the Kingston Plains, not really an issue with the concerns of burning into other people's property. It was very sparsely settled in this region at that time, as it still is to this day. But when that fire burned, it burned very hot. And it burned so hot, it baked the minerals, the nutrients right out of the soil and left it basically as a dead zone for anything to grow. And it's taken over a century for this area to come back, but yet still, in a large portion of the Kingston Plains, there is still very little vegetation growing. You'll have some small trees, mostly wild cherries, such as pin cherries and choke cherries growing. You'll get some birch, some aspen, and a little bit of pine attempting to come back now, well long past when they should have regenerated on their own. Jack pine, there's a little bit of scrub white pine growing through here. And on the edges of the Kingston Plains, the Department of Natural Resources has replanted. They have done reforestation, and it's taken off in places. But still to this day, the nutrients in the soils are very weak to really support much. It's taken over a century for the soil to reestablish itself with the duff layers of leaves and decaying vegetation of small grasses, of ferns, and really of what is the main vegetative feature on the land is what we call caribou moss, or reindeer moss. It's not a moss, it's a lichen, but it grows in rather bushiness, and it's very common on the taiga and the tundras up in the northern reaches heading towards the Arctic. And it was named after the reindeer or caribou, which used it as an important food source up in those regions where there's very little other vegetation growing. But we have that growing in northern Michigan, where it was once lumbered and then the land was exposed. It's really showing the sign of climate change based on the lumber industry. You cut down forests, it dries out. It doesn't always get hotter. In fact, there was a loss of heat from the land because it was all open and all that heat was able to escape, along with the carbon that is released, that is held in by the trees, that releases back into the atmosphere as well. So I guess where I'm pausing there to gather my thoughts, we think of climate change as a modern happening, but it isn't. It historically has happened through millennia, but we have really sped it up in the last century through the loss of forests. It can really be seen in the loss of the rainforest in the Amazon region of South America, but also in northern forests in the taiga of Russia, in the Canadian boreal forest, but it was also once shown to happen here in the Great Lakes, in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ontario. Our forests are not the same as they once were. They'll never come back to that. With the large trees, you had trees that were 4 foot to 6 foot diameter, and then there are some stumps out here in the Kingston Plains that are at least 4 foot diameter that I just kind of did a cursory survey of in my visit out here. But there's also stumps of no more than 1 foot diameter. They weren't just cutting the largest trees, but once the railroad came through, you needed to cut everything to be able to maintain the operation of the lumber operations to pay for it. At one time, they cut just the biggest and best of the white pine. 4 foot, 6 foot diameter trees, also going down to 3 foot. And they cut them seasonally in the wintertime. And you move the logs by iced roads to the sides of the rivers, floated them down the rivers to the sawmills. Once the railroad came through, though, it allowed you to be able to cut year-round. You could cut far away from the rivers, and you could also cut in the summertime where you did not need the river transportation to move the logs because the rivers would have run more shallow during the summer and fall seasons than it would have in the spring. But that railroad, it cost money. You had to build the rails. You had to hire men to do that. You had to purchase or lease your railroad equipment, your locomotives, your cars, and hire skilled labor to operate that. The engineers, the firemen, the brakemen, all needed to know what they were doing. You couldn't just hire general labor for $1 a day to work the railroad. So it was much more expensive. So they cut smaller and smaller trees, and they also cut hardwoods, maple, oak, elm, ash, really whatever good marketable hardwood was in that area, they cut them down. And you could go much further out too, though. There's areas here, the Kingston Plains, although we're not terribly far from Lake Superior, and there are small rivers in the area, it is not easy to get the logs to the rivers or to the water in this region. So they took the railroad and they took it to the banks of the Lake Superior there, where the Grand Sable Dunes are, and they built a large log slide and slid the logs right down into the lake, and then they used a barge and they pulled those logs in a large boom to Grand Marais, where there were sawmills, and that's how they were able to log off this area. Some lumber was taken directly from the rail to Grand Marais or elsewhere on the railroad lines, but many of them went right to the lake, to the log slide, and went right down into Lake Superior. I mentioned Russell Alger, the Alger Smith Company I mentioned, but their president and the majority owner of the company was Russell Alger. He had been a Civil War hero, started out in the cavalry and ended up as a general during the Civil War, served with George Armstrong Custer and his Michigan Cavalry Brigade. And then after the war, he got into the lumber business and was involved with logging in many locations in the lower peninsula, particularly Alcona County. But then his operations moved here north to the upper peninsula and also into Ontario, that I learned in the last year. But here in the upper peninsula, it was based in the Grand Marais area in what became Alger County. It was named after Russell Alger had been elected governor, and a new county was split off, and they named it for the sitting governor at the time, Russell Alger. And he made millions of dollars in the lumber industry. He was one of many lumber barons or lumbermen who became very wealthy during this time period. He continued in public service. He was appointed Secretary of War during the McKinley administration, and then he was also appointed as a U.S. Senator from Michigan, that he served for a short period of time until his death in the early 1900s. But Russell Alger, as I mentioned, was one of them involved in the lumbering, in the logging of this area of the Kingston Plains. While out in the field, I did mention that Russell Alger and the Alger Smith Company had logged the region, but they weren't the first lumbermen to be working the Kingston Plains. About 1880, the first lumberman to arrive was Thomas Sullivan, who had originally been part of the Prentice Logging Company in Alpena and Sanilac counties. And he came to the Grand Marais, established a sawmill in Grand Marais in 1880, and hired two camps of 150 men each to do logging out on the Kingston Plains. They continued to log there until the sawmill shut down in 1885. What he did, there was no railroad that reached Grand Marais at that time, is that he had skidded logs from the plains out to the Lake Superior shore, where they established a number of log slides going down into Lake Superior. One log slide on the Grand Sable Dunes still exists today and is interpreted by the Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore. On the water down there on Lake Superior, the logs would then be boomed together and would be towed by a barge or by a tug to the mill at Grand Marais. But as I mentioned, he ceased operations about 1885. In 1893, a railroad spur had made it north from Seney up to Grand Marais, and that allowed for logging operations to resume in the area because they now had the railroad to be able to move the logs from Grand Marais down to sawmills at Seney or down to Manistee. As I mentioned, the Alger Smith Company would lumber in the area, and they were succeeded as well, or working along in that same area at the same time, by the Manistee Lumber Company, the Chicago Lumbering Company, both of them being headquartered in the Manistee on Lake Michigan. And the logging continued until the trees kind of played out in the late 1890s, very early 1900s. Pine, as I mentioned, was not the only species that was cut by the loggers. After the white pine was virtually gone, they continued to cut other tree species in the area, hemlock and the hardwood such as oak and maple. Again, anything that could provide to be able to make it cost effective. But eventually, the logging ended, and that was when the fires started to come in through the area. As I mentioned, fire follows the axe. So after the logging period, and with the large amount of slash that had been left on the ground, the entire region of the Kingston Plains, along with large portions of the Upper Peninsula and the logged off areas of the Lower Peninsula, were very susceptible to forest fires. A number of fires had already hit in the area prior to the cutting of the Kingston Plains. In 1871, the Great Fire that burned a good portion of the northern Lower Peninsula. The fire that was burning at Peshtigo, Wisconsin, also burned up into Menominee County in the western Upper Peninsula and affected other areas of the western UP as well. So these fires weren't just always in one location, but they burned all over. And the fact is that there were numerous fires always burning. If there was slash on the ground, there was fire. It could be caused by lightning, could have been caused by sparks from railroads going through. It could have been caused by purposeful burning of the slash, clearing it for homesteading to build a farm. But regardless of how it began, these fires burned, and many uncontrollable. In the Kingston Plains region, notable fires burned in the 1890s, in the early 1900s, up through the 1930s. When the Chicago Lumbering Company was logging in 1891, they had teams that could not make it from Manistee up into the Kingston Plains due to fires. So these fires, they just were always burning. Betty Sodders, a Michigan author who wrote the book Michigan on Fire, she has a chapter on fires in the Upper Peninsula, and she has a chronology of the fires. And 1891, as I mentioned, there was fires reported in most of Chippewa County. That was probably fires that spread that burned into towards the Kingston Plains. 1883 to 85, prior to that, forest fires in the Newberry area further to the east. 1896 was the large fire in Ontonagon in the western Upper Peninsula, and that fire was not one that would have burned as far as the Kingston Plains, but there were likewise numerous smaller fires on the eastern UP as well. 1906, forest fires ranged from Newberry to Bessemer, a distance of 250 miles, as well as at Iron Mountain, Quinnipiac, and Marquette County. Doesn't mention Alger County, but likely there would have been fires around that area too. In 1917, when they started to record the acreage of loss, total acres burned in the UP was over 75,000 acres, with fires occurring mainly in the western end of the peninsula. 1918, 100,021 acres burned in the Upper Peninsula, with a total of 194 fires. 1919, large fires reported in the Newberry-Trout Lake area, with additional acreage burned in the western counties of the UP. So Newberry-Trout Lake, not that far from Kingston Plains. So these would have been burning number of times, or number of areas, as I mentioned again. There were also serious fires in 1936. And at that time, the CCC was now involved in the area planting trees, so they would have also been fighting fires as well. So the fires there, that was the heat that baked out all of the nutrients out of the soil. So numerous fires burning, not allowing anything to grow, anything to seed. So you could see how the Kingston Plains would become the desolate area that it is now. By the 1930s, when the Civilian Conservation Corps was doing much work for reforestation in Michigan, planting more than 484 million tree seedlings throughout the two peninsulas, there was also work being done for wildlife management. To the west of the Kingston Plains in the Cousino area near Shingleton, there were attempts to revitalize the wildlife habitat in the central Upper Peninsula. After the fires, one of the problems was the fact that there was very little coverage for habitat for wildlife, including white-tailed deer. Now, it's something that most people would be very surprised about now, but at the beginning of the 20th century and up through really into the 1940s and 50s, there were very little white-tailed deer in northern Michigan. Their habitat had been pretty much wiped out. And with the reforestation efforts, it brought back a lot of that. And at Camp Cousino of the CCC and with the adjacent Michigan Department of Conservation Wildlife Station, there were attempts to kind of help the habitat for the white-tailed deer. They also attempted to bring moose back into the Upper Peninsula at this time. That failed at that time. It wasn't until the 1980s that moose would be successfully reintroduced to the Upper Peninsula. But they also worked with bird species. One of the few silver linings of having a stump field such as the Kingston Plains was for new species of birds such as prairie chicken and sharp-tailed grouse that did not like the thick forest coverage like their cousins, the spruce grouse and the ruffed grouse, but they liked more open field areas, and both thrived in the region. Sharp-tailed grouse are still found in the Kingston Plains area, and it's really the only location in Michigan where you're going to find the sharp-tailed grouse, and it's actually managed for that now. Prairie chicken, on the other hand, they held on through a good portion of the 20th century in various regions, the Kingston Plains, also in the northern lower peninsula. But as reforestation was successful, they were crowded out by thicker forested areas and retreated back to their native areas of the Great Plains, the central prairies in the more western United States, of what you would find them in places like Kansas and Nebraska and up through that area today. In 2023, I presented a paper entitled Fire Follows the Axe. Was about the climate change and lumber industry in the upper Great Lakes in the 19th and early 20th century. Presented it at a conference of the Association of Living History, Farm, and Agriculture Museums at Sauter Village in Archbold, Ohio. Part of my presentation was about the Kingston Plains. And I was connecting the lumber industry, the wildfires, and with climate change of what happened at that time, localized there after the fires, and comparison to what's happening today in the modern period of the 21st century. Just to help prove that climate change is not new. It's just something that's become a much more important issue than what it was considered previously. As part of my paper, I talked a little bit about the environmental damage from logging, and I want to read a little bit of that to close out today's episode on the Kingston Plains. There was a great environmental impact from logging on the landscape and natural resources of the upper Great Lakes. There was a huge impact on the previously forested lands and the adjacent waters from fire, erosion, and runoff. Wildlife was also greatly impacted by the lumber industry. The cutover lands were altered permanently, from large mature forest, many being old-growth forests of 200 to 600 years old, to treeless plains, or land supporting only small tree species and brushy plants. Millions of acres of forests were lost. This contributed to dry and warmer climate conditions. Forests are great for holding in moisture and moderating temperatures. Trees not only use moisture from rainfall, snowmelt, and dew for themselves, but when they have an excess amount of water, the trees will use transpiration to release water vapor into the air from their leaves. This elevates the local humidity, which aids in keeping the fire hazard down. The mature forest also provided much-needed shade for other plant and wildlife. The fires that burned through after logging, utilizing the abundance of slash and other fuel, burned hotter and stronger than previous fires that would burn frequently along the forest floor. These stronger fires at extreme temperatures not only consumed still standing trees by racing up the trunks into the crowns, but also superheated the topsoil, baking the minerals out of the soil. This left the soil unable to support all but the most minimal of life. More than a century later, some of the cutover lands support very little tree cover, having the burned stumps as the main feature of the land, and reindeer lichen as the most common plant life, vegetation that is more common on the tundra of the Arctic Circle. Not only through the burning of the nutrients, but also of the lack of shade cover affected the regrowth of the forest. For succession pine forests, there is a need, especially for the white pine, to have a series of pioneer species, to first recover an area and allow for shade to temperate the extreme heat and cold to protect the young seedlings and immature trees. In a clear-cut and burned-over land, there is nothing to allow the seedlings to succeed. Pioneer species of aspen, birch, and pin and choke cherries, also known as the ABC trees, are usually the first trees to come back after a disturbance in the forest. Under normal conditions of a storm or small fire, this will happen almost immediately. However, under catastrophic circumstances, it can take decades, even a century, for these species to reestablish themselves. The ABC trees generally have a lifespan of 60 to 70 years. During this time frame, the pines have an opportunity to come back as well. Young pine seedlings are very fragile, susceptible to the hot, dry summer sun and to late and early frosts and freezes. The tree cover of a copse of aspen or birch and individual choke and pin cherries will protect these young trees until they can more establish themselves. The local red pine, also known as Norway pine, is more hardier and can withstand the extreme temperatures, so would become the predominant species for reforestation. In normal forest succession, the pine would be ready to take over at the time period that the ABC species were in their decline. But again, the disruption of the normal succession put everything out of whack. I want to thank you for listening to me today. Hopefully you learned a little bit about the Kingston Plains and why this is such a unique ecosystem that we have in northern Michigan. And if you get a chance to visit it, I really encourage you to. It is managed by the Department of Natural Resources as part of the Lake Superior State Forest. And as I mentioned, it's located southwest of Grand Marais and south of the Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore. If you're traveling around along County Road H58 at Pictured Rocks, going from Munising to Grand Marais, you will hit a little corner section of the Kingston Plains, and there'll be the Kingston Truck Trail and the Adams Truck Trail, and those are the roads that can take you along through to where the Kingston Plains are located. And you can actually take the Adams Truck Trail all the way to Michigan Highway 77 that connects between Grand Marais and Seney. As I mentioned, it's such a unique place, and I would love to guide people out there if I ever have the opportunity. So stay tuned for another episode of the North Country History podcast. And I'm Rob Berg. I thank you for listening today. And if you enjoyed this episode, please tell a friend. And that's the best way to get more people to listen to this. Thanks, and I'll be talking to you again. North Country History with Rob Berg is hosted, written, and produced by Rob Berg. Music is Crack o' Dawn, performed by Reveille, licensed through Soundstripe. Follow North Country History with Rob Berg on YouTube and on Facebook at Rob Berg, Environmental Historian.